TikTok, time to rock. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's watching from all over the world. I'm your friendly neighborhood philosopher, D Wood, aka The Dizzle. And with me now is a detective who's known me for several years and yet has not solved most of the crimes I've committed in my life. How you doing, Jay?
I'm doing well. You know that video you did on the different kinds of police officers that are out there?
Oh, yeah.
I watched that. Okay, I was just fascinated by it, and I think there's that. It could probably also be said though of like different kinds of pastors that are out there. That's what I was thinking as you were saying. But also it could be said probably different kinds of suspects that are out there. Anyway, my point is.
Yeah, and really, it's that. In case anyone's wondering, he's talking about my video, why some people hate cops or something like that.
Great video, by the way.
Yeah,
Great video.
and what that really comes down to is there are different personality types, and different personality types get into certain situations, and they can behave very differently. But it wouldn't matter if you're the danger of the cop is all of a sudden this guy's got a gun and massive power over other people.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you that for me, as a cop who was in the profession about 8 years before I got saved, it was the gospel that changed everything for me. It changed my perspective on everyone I encountered. It changed my perspective on the role I was serving in the community. It changed everything. It turns out the gospel cures every kind of stupid you can think of, okay, including cop stupid. So, yeah. It was,
I think even though we're here to talk about your new book, we might want to get into that. But before we get started, the one question on everyone's mind, since you are a cold case detective, who killed Biggie?
Do you know how many cases I get emails or I get a message on Twitter? Hey, can you solve my brother's death? Can you solve oh my goodness, really? So I always tell people that no. Because it would require me to deep dive into the details, right? And that's where I'm always lost, is on the details. So no, I cannot tell you that. I cannot answer that or any other question that somebody might put in the chat or actually ask us.
Well, that is a huge letdown. I thought we were finally going to get an answer.
No, you're not going to get an answer. If you're going to get a lie, basically, I would just say something that's stupid and random, so that won't work.
Now, you told me. I think you told me last time that a cold case detective is never like officially retired. That you could get called up because some case that you're supposed to be working on. So you could actually like get called tomorrow, and they'd be like, hey, we just got some new info on the Taco Bell massacre of '82, and you might have to like jump into action.
Because I was stupid enough to touch the case means that I will always be connected to the case and at some point appear as when I was doing Datelines, what I used to love was I was the guy who was solving the case, and the other detectives who were interviewed were the old guys who didn't solve it. Well, here's the problem now. Is I'm in danger of being one of the old guys who didn't solve it, right? Because the only things that are left are the open cases that I just didn't finish. So yeah, I hate the idea that I will now be the guy who I used to not want to be on Dateline. That's going to be me.
Yeah, there are two family mottos in my family. One is, if you're going to walk on thin ice, you might as well dance. Grew up on that one. And the other is, it ain't a crime if you don't get caught. And so I don't know how other people are raised. I was raised, it ain't a crime if you don't get caught. And so
I think that was pretty much the motto I had for many years as well. So that's why the gospel does change things, right? You know what I think happens, honestly, David? I think what happens is, have you heard this too? It's like we hear this story that that we hire, we're not doing a good job hiring at the point of hire. And then we hire these people we shouldn't hire. And then 10 years later, they do something they shouldn't do. And it comes back to, who are you hiring? You're hiring a bunch of racists? Here's what I think really happens. What I think really happens is we hire people who are vetted pretty well, as much as you can vet any, but nobody that vets. We have a polygraph, we have a psych, we have 2 oral boards, we have a background search, it's like proctologist kind of a background search, okay? And then we hire that guy. And I was one of those guys. I was raised in an environment with my mom where she is the most loving, kind of accepting, just her and me growing up, just the two of us, and I could not have been in a better place when you hired me. And then what happens is you get detailed out and dispatched to the worst that anyone can offer in your community. You never see anything good. And you get this small kind of microscopic view of culture, which is not real. And you start to think, well, everyone in this group, whatever group it may be, and I can work in an entirely monochromatic area where you're all the same color. But at some point, you're going to say, if you're from that side of the town, they're all like this. No, they're not all like that. That's just all you're getting dispatched to. But what happens is that guy they hired 10 years in becomes the guy who now you're ready to fire because you turned him into this guy.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that for me, about 8 years in, I got saved. Mm-hmm. And then it changed everything. No longer was I willing to see the world the way it was being presented to me visually or being detailed to a certain detail. I knew that we were all created in God's image, and it just changed the way I saw my own role in the community. So that's why I always say that, the gospel does cure every kind of stupid, including every kind of cop stupid, every kind of cultural stupid, every kind of whatever, bad guy stupid. You name it, it solves it. Mm-hmm. But for me, I got lucky. I was 8 years in, and I got saved. And it kept me from becoming jaded about what I was being dispatched to.
Yeah. Since there will be people in the chat and viewers, of course, later on who may not be familiar with you. I know most will be. But if you could just give people your basic story, just a little bit of background.
I came out of I'm a cold case detective here in Los Angeles County. I did it for about 25 years. And I ended up retiring. And of course, you have some open cases that kind of follow you. So you get called, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So I still consult. The DA, for example, will often call me to help him form a closing argument or form a rebuttal or whatever. So I do a lot of that stuff still. But for me, those are unsolved murders. And that started with me becoming a police officer. And it wasn't my plan. I was raised up really in the arts. I got a bachelor's degree in design, a master's degree in architecture. I was working as an architect in Los Angeles County and Santa Monica when I realized that the profession of my father was probably going to be a better way to raise kids. It seemed like a noble profession. It seemed like a family profession. It seemed like it had regular hours. Creatives can spend their entire lives at the office because if you tell us, hey, if you work 10 more hours, this will be a better building, I'll work 10 more hours. And that's not going to be paid. That's going to be just on salary because I want the thing to be the best it can be. It's my creative expression. And I just knew that would be my life. So I left architecture and I became a police officer. And I was not a Christian until maybe 8 or 9 years into the job, about 8 years into the job. And then I walked into a church with my wife. We were not raised in a Christian. I was not raised in a Christian setting. I didn't have any family members who were Christians. Didn't know anybody who was a Christian growing up. My dad's not a Christian. Although I loved everything about, I admired his work. I ended up following him into the profession. But I walked into that church, and this knucklehead pastor was really good at reaching people where we are. And he said a lot of things that first day. But he said that I only went into that church, by the way, because my wife kind of forced me into that church. Not forced me, but I mean, she about 3 years into her saying, hey, let's go to church, I eventually went to church. Mm-hmm. And I did it just because to please her. And ended up hearing the pastor say that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived, which I thought that's a lie. But I bought a Bible to see if that was true. And that's what started this whole thing for me. And so I just kind of looked at the Bible first and asked the question, are these gospels reliable for what they tell me? Well, there's a process in place. So I just applied the process I knew to apply to witnesses to see if these were, in fact, witnesses and if they were reliable. And that's how I ended up becoming a Christian. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of, my story. And I'm one of those few people you might meet who would say, well, yeah, well, no, look, I'm not saying that I came to faith through apologetics or through the evidence. But I think the evidence helped me to pull down the barriers that I had constructed in front of the gospel. Mm-hmm. So I never would have paid attention to your stupid gospel. But then because I had all these things, I thought this is why. I needed to go through those things and kind of deconstruct my own skepticism. Mm-hmm. And that's what, luckily for me, I was in a place where I had examined eyewitnesses and I knew how to do that. So that's what I did in order to kind of knock down the walls, the barriers that I had built between myself and the gospel.
And then you started cranking out some books. Eh?
Well, it wasn't quite that fast. I mean, I probably was a Christian maybe 15, 10, I don't know how many years I was a Christian, but I was teaching high schoolers. My kids were like 6 and 8 when I got saved. So I just hopped into their Sunday school class. And of course, the church was like, oh, you're going to be here every week? Well, not necessarily. Well, one of us is going to be here probably because the kid wouldn't just sit still. Oh, you're going to be here? Well, your wife or you, can you teach this class? Well, we weren't even Christians yet. But the church we were in said, hey, you know what? If you can teach the curriculum, you can still help. So we got the curriculum a week before the kids got it, and we figured out what to teach. And before long, we're teaching Sunday school. But by the time I'm a Christian and my kids are getting older, I just followed them. Mm-hmm. And they were like high schoolers. I was their high school pastor by that time. I was a believer, and I had actually been to seminary by that time.
So were kids like, oh, cool, this guy's a detective? Or were they like, uh-oh, we got a detective around here?
Well, you know what? Yeah, a little bit of both. I think when I was working gangs, I had a partner who was much younger than me, and he was hipper than me.
And I find that hard to believe. Come on.
Yeah, I know, right? We were just talking before we started, right? You're the old guy in the room. I'm the old guy. So, but I was the old guy then, too. I was probably 40. And no, I wasn't. I was in my 30s. Mm-hmm. This guy was in his 20s, early 20s, and he could speak the language of gangsters. I mean, he would get out of the car. We had soft uniforms. We had a car without a light bar. Our job was to go out and hang out with gangsters all day. And then when someone says, hey, you know, I'm looking for a guy who's got this over here. Oh, I know who that guy is because we know everybody. So we basically would do this every day. And the guy who was young, he was like really cool, and he could speak their language. It fit right in, and they get out of the car, he'd speak language. I'm what the heck is he even talking? I mean, I'm his partner. I don't know what he's talking about. And I realized early on, I'm not going to be able to play that game. That's not who I am. I'm not from that culture, and I'm not young enough. I'm not. So I took a very paternal role, and the gangsters responded to the paternal role I played because, to be honest with you, most of them, their dads were locked up, or they didn't know who their dad was, or they had a dad who was a deadbeat dad who wasn't really involved in their lives. And if somebody just seemed to care, that went a long way. So as a youth pastor, I knew I couldn't be the cool guy who knew all the songs they were singing, but I could be dad. And I just was dad. And that was how I basically served as a youth pastor.
Well, now things are making sense that you wanted to be a cold case detective because you could get into the mind of someone who committed a crime like 50 years ago. Because, you know, that's your mindset, right? You're like, I get that.
Something tells me you were headed that way. Okay, yes, but that is true.
I get why old man Smithers killed those people.
That's right.
They were on his lawn. They're on his lawn, I say.
Get off my lawn, dang it.
Solved.
Yeah, exactly. I do worry sometimes, though, David, that I can get to that point where I start to see that get off my lawn kind of attitude, and so
I've had that a long time, and I'm not even that old.
Well, but my grandfather was not like that. My grandfather Warner, whose name I have, he was like this. He was teachable, and he was humble, and that gave him a youthful kind of aspect of his. And so I want to be that guy. I want to be teachable. I want to be humble, and I want to be accessible. That's what keeps you young. I look at myself in these videos, like we're doing this live. Okay, I know when I watch this video, I'm going to be very disappointed with the fact that I am now at this age. I don't feel this age inside. But when I see myself, I'm like, oh, really? But the reality of it is that age has to, I mean, I can't fight the chronological issues, but I can fight the mindset. And so I just have to kind of hang on to the things that my grandfather showed me when we were growing up. He was always the youngest person in the room, and he was like, he died when he was 90. So I think that this is, I want to be like him.
That's funny because, the guys in my family, once they get older, they start losing their faculties. But there's a part of me who thinks that would kind of be fun. Like if I get, if I live to 80 and so on, most of the guys in my family die at like 50. But the ones who live and become old, they lose their faculties. And I'm just like, man, as long as I have accomplished everything I want to accomplish and, I've handed things over to the next generation and so on, I don't know, kind of be cool sitting around and
Yeah, I know, right?
forgetting everything,
I'm
and
with you. I don't mind losing my faculties. I just don't want to lose my continence. Okay, faculties. I couldn't care less. Because the great thing about losing your faculties is, as you're losing them, you also lose the fact that you're concerned about losing your
yeah,
faculties. You lose them all simultaneously. Who cares? Yeah. So I think that's
yeah,
that. I'm with you on that. I agree with you on
that'd
that.
be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Now, books. Most people would be familiar with you from Cold Case Christianity. But you've got this new book, and I have to say it's a little concerning because mine already came with blood spatters on it. So, I
You know
mean,
what I'm worried about? I mean, this is just an aside, you and I.
uh
That the first version of this has the shiny blood spatter.
this is
But
shiny.
I saw a bunch that don't have that shiny. They just kind of printed them up cheaper.
Yeah,
So I'm hoping that
you
that
can see the
stays
shiny.
on. Yeah, it looks
Yeah,
like
see?
it's actually
Yeah,
blood.
making sure the light shines off it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like that.
No, it looks like
Right?
wet blood. So,
Yes. And you know what we did? They sent me a bunch of covers. And when I told them, when they said, "Hey, they'll typically do this, right?" Like, I'm always concerned about how the book images because of my art background. So I said to them, I'm going to tell you what I want. I want a book cover that looks like a fictional novel. I want like a murder mystery. And that's the one they came up with. And I thought, that works. But only because I think the stuff that you and I do is so important. We're making a case for why this is true versus alternatives. But I don't think the church gives a lick about this. I don't think the church really cares much about, fiction is still the highest. Romance fiction sells more than any other genre to Christians. So we have to kind of figure out, how do we make inroads? So that's why we're trying to, do that.
You also got to figure out, because you got to figure out who's killing people at Amazon or Zondervan, because there's a body in the rafters leaking blood all over your stuff here.
That's right.
So
that's the
anyway,
hope.
yeah, but all you care is talking about the book. Meanwhile,
Yes.
Bob
People are
is
dying.
hanging,
I know.
hanging from the
That's
rafters.
right.
All right.
Well, you know how this is. If you work homicides long enough, you're like, really? What matters to me most is what time I'm going to get off. Am I going to make dinner? Okay, sorry. I know your loved one's dead, but I have a life. Okay, so
Gosh, I think
Exactly.
I think you may be the real psychopath here, Jay. All right. Well, I'm on the Wikipedia page for Person of Interest. It says Person of Interest is an American science fiction crime drama television series that aired on CBS from 2011 to 2016. So, tell everyone, why did you decide to write a book about this TV show, starring Jim Caviezel?
I know. If you Google, well, we're trying to actually dump that out. We're trying to bump that off the Wikipedia and replace it with our book. No, the idea of person of interest was, I don't even like. I never used that term in my entire career, but it started to pop up. I think after either right before or after 9/11. Usually it started off with like terrorism and like who's the person of interest, who is the primary witness to something. I saw it used this week where they're talking with the kid who's on trial for the Kenosha shootings. Like, a person of interest is the person who's chasing him, because even victims are being described as persons of interest. So for me, it's a term that if I was going to have a potential suspect, I would just tell you he's a potential suspect. I would probably just use those terms. Or I wouldn't probably tell you anything, because if you're asking me as a reporter, I'm not going to tell you anything. You can get that information once the case is filed. I'm not going to tell you anything in advance. But I do understand that sometimes there's a person of interest. Maybe you're trying to find a potential witness. Like someone said there's a redhead who was wearing a green shirt who was standing. So that's a person of interest to us. If you know anybody who's a red, who owns a green shirt, who was there on the night of this murder, would you please contact us? We want to identify who that person of interest is so we can interview them. Well, that's different. But if it's a suspect, I typically wouldn't say anything. But I do know that that's an expression that is used to identify potential suspects. So what we're doing here is trying to use that, say, hey, who is the potential suspect that turns what we call the first century into the first century? Right? Because it wasn't the first century. It was never the first century. It was always how many centuries into the history of humans? Many centuries. But the idea here is that we're trying to say, look, this is the potential, this is the suspect, this is the person of interest who turns history on its side.
Okay, so the takeaway from that was, do not trust redheads. I agree.
Yes.
That redhead,
I have a redhead. I have a redheaded daughter. Okay,
Oh.
so I know this is. I'm going to tell you just from my experience with Mia that you should not trust redheads.
All right, now for everyone in the chat, if you've read or if you started to read Person of Interest, let us know your thoughts over there in the chat. Or if you've read one of Jay's earlier books, let's see, you had Cold Case Christianity, you had God's Crime Scene. Were there any more? Those are the ones I remember.
Forensic Faith is the other
Forensic Faith.
Apologetics book, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. If you've read any of those apologetics books, let us know in the comments section what you think. And Jay, this is a really, really kind of big book as far as covering anything we might want to cover in a short live stream. But why don't you give people a taste, and you could go in any direction you want.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go in the direction that you inspired, because it was our talk about a year ago when I was still trying to formulate ideas. It was before I'd actually submitted the manuscript. And that's why I mentioned you in the first paragraph of this manuscript, because it was really important. I'm only taking a very 30,000 feet view of the stuff that you deep dive here on this channel constantly. So I knew that you were the Jedi Master that would. I was just happy to be the Padawan in this sense. Okay, so I want to share with you just real quickly a presentation. Oops, I messed it up already. Dang it! Hang on. You're going to control that. Why am I doing that? Okay, so here we go. So here's the presentation for. I had this all set up. There we go. Now we're good to go.
All right. So
okay,
you'd like me to put your slides up on the screen?
Yes, put the slides on the screen.
And you have that great art background. So
yes, this is how I always do it. They gave me 2 years to develop these presentations first before I began writing. So here's kind of the fuse that leads up to the explosive appearance of Jesus. Here's what we're doing in this book. We're saying, hey, if you don't, I do a lot of no body murders, and that's where someone gets rid of the body and they claim this person ran off. Well, what do you do if you have no evidence in a crime scene? Well, you make the case from the fuse leading up to the explosive event and the fallout following. So here's Jesus standing in history, and there's a fuse burning up to the explosive appearance of Jesus. And if you look at that fuse, you'll see that the fuse involves 3 strands, which I describe in the book, and the fallout involves 5 areas of fallout. Now, all I'm going to do tonight with you is talk about the spiritual fallout. And so here's what because that's something you talk about a lot here when you're talking about Islam. So if you look at Jesus on the timeline of history, you have a fuse leading up to the appearance of Jesus and fallout that follows the appearance of Jesus. Now, there are a number of world religions that are on the fallout side of Jesus. And I've got them listed here. Now, I'm putting in New Age, but clearly that's not an organized world religion, but there is a view that's held by many millions of people across the globe. So here we have these 4 kind of theistic or spiritual worldviews, let's put it that way. Interestingly, you will find Jesus in every one of these. You will find Jesus mentioned because he's either mentioned, merged, or modified. In every one of these, on the pages of the Quran, as of course you know, on the Holy Scripture of Baha'u'llah, the Baha'i faith. So in all of these, even New Agers will mention Jesus in a very admirable way. Now, interestingly, though, there are some world religions, and let's just go back and show you those that precede Jesus. Here they are in the fuse. So these are ancient mythologies, and some of these are still active world religions that preceded Jesus. Interestingly, Jesus is also mentioned and merged and modified in these world religions, which makes no sense, right? Because they precede Jesus. But here's the thing. A lot of these extend into the Common Era. And as the worshipers were worshiping in the Common Era, they now began to change or include or modify their beliefs to include Jesus. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here's kind of the chronology of Jesus in time. Let's go to something quite ancient, Hinduism. That precedes Jesus, but it turns out that if you read the writings of Hindu leaders today, you'll find that they mention Jesus in a very favorable light. In fact, they even merge Jesus in, and they consider him to be part of their construct. They consider him to be divine. The world leaders in Hinduism will actually mention Jesus in a favorable way. For example, they will mention the details of Jesus's life. They not only consider him favorably, they merge and mention his detail. You could reconstruct part of the story of Jesus just from the teaching of the leaders of Hinduism. So, for example, if you were someplace where Hinduism dominates the landscape, well, it turns out that Jesus You know something about Jesus just from your own Hindu leaders because he is embraced in some way. Now let's take a look at the second, Attis. No one's worshiping Attis anymore. But it's interesting that after Attis worshipers enter into the Common Era, they begin to modify their beliefs. And they begin to modify them in a way that sounds like Christianity. Never before. You won't find these descriptions of Attis prior to Jesus, but after Jesus, suddenly Attis, his body did not see corruption, just like Jesus. They somehow, now suddenly the Attis story includes a death and resurrection. This is not something that Jesus borrowed from Attis. This only occurs in Attis worship after Jesus. And for example, Heracles, very similar. Once Heracles is worshipped after Jesus, the worship of Heracles modifies. It changes. Suddenly he takes on the language, the titles of Jesus. He performs the miracles of Jesus. He sounds a lot more like Jesus than he did prior to Jesus. Well, why is that happening? Same is true for Krishna. As a matter of fact, if you look at how people worshipped Krishna prior to Jesus, it's very different. The titles given to Krishna prior to Jesus, very different. So again, you see this change occurring based on the influence of Christianity on other world religions. In fact, you'll see that people today who are like Hare Krishna will argue that Jesus is, in their minds, the perfect guru, someone who is sent by God. They even will give him the title of Son of God and Lord. So again, you see this happening. And by the way, they'll also repeat the details. So if you were to look at Hare Krishnas across the globe, you would learn something about Jesus from non-Christians because they are either modifying, mentioning, or merging Jesus in some way. So if you look at the Mithras, for example, often Mithras is offered as like, oh, the story of Jesus was stolen from Mithras. Well, really, study Mithras. Study the Mithraic religion, the mystery religion. You'll see that for the most part, there's nothing similar from Mithras to Jesus until you get post-Jesus. And suddenly the worshipers of Mithras are doing the same things that worshipers of Jesus do. So now, and Buddhism is the last ancient, prior to Jesus. Buddhism existed prior to Christianity. And you'll see that even now, the religious leaders within Buddhism will argue that Jesus is within the Buddhist tradition in some way. He's an enlightened teacher. He is somebody who's on his way to Buddhahood, they'll say. Also, they'll mention the details related to Jesus's life. So if you are a Buddhist somewhere in the world and you're paying attention to today's Buddhist leaders, you know something about Jesus even though you're not in a Christian environment because Buddhists repeat the story of Jesus. And now this is all of the people who precede Jesus. And I'm just doing this illustration so you can see that they're modifying, merging, or mentioning Jesus even today for those groups that still worship today. But now let's go to those who follow Jesus, like Islam. Well, I don't need to tell you about this because you already know that there's a role. Jesus is on the pages of the Quran and on the pages of Islamic scripture. And you'll see that he's merged in some way. He's considered in a way that is very similar to how he's considered in Christianity, or at least he's venerated in some way. So that if you are a Muslim somewhere in the world, you know something about Jesus, built on the true story of Jesus in the way that Muslims have merged or modified or mentioned Jesus in their own scripture. Baha'i is the same way. Under Baha'i, Jesus is another manifestation of God, just as Baha'i. And as a matter of fact, all of this detail of the Gospels is mentioned by Baha'u'llah in the Holy Scriptures of the Baha'i faith. So you can get all of this information from Baha'is about Jesus. And of course, they merge him into their system. They accept him as another manifestation of God. So if you're somewhere in the world where Baha'i is worshipped, well, you know something about Jesus just from your Baha'i scripture and from your Baha'i leadership. And even like Ahmadi Muslims, well, of course, they think that Jesus actually visited, and here you get a lot of information. They mention many details about Jesus in their own scripture and from the mouths of their leaders, and they will merge Jesus into their system as a wise teacher. So if you're somewhere in the world where Ahmadi Muslims worship, you know something about Jesus just from your religious system. And finally, we'll go to New Age. So New Age believers are hard to kind of lock down, kind of like Buddhists and Hindus. There's not like an overarching set of principles I can refer to say, hey, this is what every Muslim, or what every Buddhist thinks, for example, or you can't really say that about Buddhists. You can't really say that about Hindus. You can't really say that about New Agers either. But what you will see is a veneration of Jesus. They have a tendency to think of Jesus in high regard, and they will merge Jesus in as an example of exemplary behavior, of worldview, all of this stuff as an excellent teacher. So if we're someplace where Islam, now here what I've done is I've just given you, this is the overlap. This is all of the systems overlap. So only a few countries on this map are not highlighted. So this is where people know something about Jesus, even though they aren't exposed to Jesus through Christianity. And what do they know? Well, this is the collective data you can get from non-Christian sources related to both the childhood, ministry, teaching, crucifixion, resurrection, disciples, return of Jesus, the titles of Jesus. All of this can be gleaned not from Christian scriptures, but from the worldview of other non-Christian sources. And what's interesting about these is all these folks seek to include Jesus in some way, while Jesus never returns the favor. He doesn't do that. In fact, he basically says, no, sorry, folks, I'm the only way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one's going to come to the Father except through me. So I'm just going to stop right there. That to me was interesting. I'll do one more step. If you look at the this is the fuse and the fallout of a typical murder case. You're looking at behaviors the suspect did before she goes missing, and then behaviors afterwards to see like what actually happened, even though you have no evidence in a crime scene. Well, even if you destroyed every New Testament, you would still know everything you need to know about Jesus just from the fuse and fallout of history. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book, right? To show that, hey, this dude, Jesus, this nobody, had more impact on, for example, literature than any other historical figure in the history of historical figures. And I can walk through all of these categories of literature. He had more impact, for example, on art than any other character. Any other, if you say, well, there's a fictional character that had this kind of impact on, who is it? No, there's no other historical figure who's had this impact on art. As a matter of fact, if you Google all the top artists in every genre of art, and that's what I did for a living, I will tell you that every single artist in every single genre throughout history, the top 3 artists, they've all painted, etched, sculpted, or drawn Jesus of Nazareth. No other historical figure can say that. The same is true for music. The history of music is so utterly dependent. And if you think, well, yeah, it's just Western music. No, actually, it turns out everything now is exported through the stupid glowing rectangles in our hands, okay, the phones. Everything is exported. This impact Jesus has on music is global. And the history of the instruments we play, the musical notation in which we read and write music, harmonies we use within music, all came out of a culture of singing that Jesus initiated. Wasn't initiated. The Jews had this culture. David wrote psalms. Jesus sang a hymn, probably a psalm of David, at the Lord's Supper. No one has been sung about more than Jesus of Nazareth, period. And all of our educational, if you think you know anything about upper education, the kinds of universities that we know today were founded by Christ followers who were raised up in a worldview that is a teaching worldview. Jesus said, tell you what, make disciples, teaching them everything I have taught you. He initiates a teaching culture. And as a matter of fact, all of the scientists in history who mattered, the scientists who founded the major scientific disciplines, for example, during the scientific revolution, sorry, they're not Muslim. They're Christian. There was a golden age of scientific discovery within Islam, but it was superseded and overwhelmed by the Christian worldview that is now responsible for more founders, fathers, and mothers of scientific disciplines than any other group, than all other groups combined. Not only that, you can reconstruct more about Jesus from science fathers than you can from church fathers. That's how much they wrote about Jesus. And finally, there's the thing we talked about tonight, which is world religions. No one has had this impact on world religions. So this is why I'm going to stop sharing this. Well, I'll let you stop sharing the screen. So this is why, David, I am so committed to this project, because I feel like we just have not been taught this in schools. For the most part, we don't hear about this, the impact of Jesus. We've forgotten that we're standing on the shoulders of Jesus of Nazareth and his followers. In all the things that mattered to me as an atheist, that was art, literature, music, education, science. Those things would not be as we know them today if not for Christians and not for the worldview inaugurated. The reason why we call the first century, there's nobody else who could have done this other than Jesus. And by the way, if there's no other fictional character that has had this kind of impact, it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is not a fictional character. And if there's no other mortal human who has had this kind of impact, then it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is not just a mortal human. He's had the only kind of impact, you can only describe it. If God entered into his own creation, I'm guessing he would have this kind of impact. And that's the kind of impact that Jesus had.
That's interesting. So that last thing you said right there, you could actually make a kind of Bayesian argument out of that. I don't mean using a full-fledged Bayes theorem, but you can use a modified form of Bayes' theorem to compare hypotheses and say, so if you have this hypothesis that Jesus is Lord versus this hypothesis that he's a mere human being, or this hypothesis that he is a fictional character, and then you develop expectations based on what you would expect from the hypothesis. So just pretend that you didn't know any of the evidence that you would cover in your book, and you say, okay, if Jesus were just this, what would you expect to find? If Jesus were this, what would you expect to find? Oh, if Jesus is actually Lord, and this is sort of God's entering into creation, what would you expect? And then you say which would fit the evidence better. It is interesting that everyone wants a piece of Jesus, right? I mean, everyone wants to have Jesus. Like, I don't care whether Muhammad agrees with me or not. I'd be kind of horrified if Muhammad agreed with me on a lot of things, even though he does. I'm kind of joking there. Muhammad, because he drew a lot of things from Christian beliefs. You do have a lot of similarities, but it would never occur to me if I were inventing something that I have to include Muhammad, or I have to include Buddha, or I have to include any of these other people, and yet everyone wants Jesus on their side.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I think that and I always say it this way. When I had a case one time. It was a woman who was killed in 1979, and she was pretty promiscuous, and she was had a lot of boyfriends. And so I had a suspect pool of about 8. And I had good reason to have 8 in that suspect pool, given the kind of life she was living. But ultimately, I took those 8 and I started working through those 8. And one emerged from the 8. And the reason why he emerged is because he had unique characteristics that the other 7 didn't have. So, for example, he had a unique relationship. He had a unique kind of anger level. He had a unique access to her. He had a unique skill set to build the kind of weapon that was actually used in the crime. This separated him from the other 7. And when you see that uniqueness occurs, where you just have 7 who seem like they're kind of the same, and then you have the 1, that kind of gives you a direction in terms of who you should be looking at. Well, something similar happens with Jesus, right? In the sense that he offers a unique worldview which excludes any other involvement of any other system. And he also offers a way to God that is unique in the sense that, it's not what you can do, and that every other system offers a set of checklists. Do this, that, and now you have access to God. Whereas he's saying, no, actually, we think you're so lame, you can't do any of that stuff. I'm going to have to do it for you. That's a unique view. So it's just that the fact that everyone will hat tip and mention him, yet he won't return the favor, it seems odd to me. Right? I mean, it's not like he's the first founder of any world religion. He's following Buddhism. He's following Krishna. He's following Hinduism. He's following Zoroaster. These are things that he doesn't care. He's following, even in Judaism, he's saying, no, there's a break here. Yes, he's within that tradition, but now I am the only way to the Father. I don't know how except through Jesus. I don't know how that's a very different, he's that one suspect in 8. That seems to separate himself based on his uniqueness, which is why, honestly, that's one of the reasons why I was so intrigued by him. The more you study other faith systems, the more confidence I had in Jesus.
Mm-hmm. And as far as a lot of the material you cover about the impact that Jesus had. One, it's important because most apologetics books don't cover any of this unless it's a just a like part of the introduction on the impact of Jesus. But there's tons of apologetics books that would cover Jesus' resurrection, arguments for the existence of God, things like that. But I was this really hit home with me. This was several years ago. I did a debate with an atheist at Columbia University, and after the debate, some of the atheist students asked me if I would come hang out with them because they wanted to discuss this stuff more. So I went and was hanging out with. They were all Asian. It was like 5 or 6 Asian atheist students. And we're all talking. And so I'm sitting there giving arguments. And here's this argument for the existence of God. And here's this argument for why Jesus is Lord. I'm giving you these arguments. And finally, one of them said, I don't care if it's true. I just care that it's bad. And that was shocking to me. That was shocking to me, right? Because I'm thinking, I don't believe in Islam, and I think Islam is bad. If Islam were true, I would want to know it. I would want to know that that's true. If I somehow knew that it was true, my response would not be, well, I don't care because it's bad or something like that. But I was listening, and so this student said, I don't care if it's true. I just care that it's bad. And thought this was shocking. And so I asked the student beside him, hey, do you agree with that? And she said yes. And I went down the line. Every last one of them all agree. They don't care if it's true or not. They only care that Christianity is bad for the world. And so I thought that was interesting that I'm sitting here giving arguments to people who do not care about the arguments at all. They only care that they've been convinced from, watching Dawkins and things like that, that religion is bad and all the impact has been bad. And so I told Paul Copan once, I said, I think the stuff, because Paul Copan covers a lot of stuff about the impact that Christianity has had, and namely wherever missionaries have gone, literacy rates have gone through the roof.
Right.
Wherever
teaching culture. Yeah, go ahead.
He said women's rights are massively increased. And any of you are thinking, no, I know a place where women, guys, go back before Christianity and check out the situation. The work ethic in why Europe took off massively is because it was like part of Orthodox Protestantism that a certain work ethic is that work was good. It's good to work really hard and so on. And things just took off. And so it's and then as you were talking about on science, like the atheists almost had me convinced for a while that they were the driving force and stuff. And so as you go back, I mean, for the first 2 centuries, the entire scientific revolution, everyone there is either a Catholic Christian, a Protestant Christian, or some sort of heretical Christian, but they all believe in God. They all believe in the Bible. And not only that, they put forward as their driving force of their work that they viewed it as a kind of worship. They're actually worshiping God by trying to understand what he has created, because that's going to give you some sort of access to the mind of God. They're viewing it as a form of worship, and they only believe that they're going to find these laws of nature and so on because they believe that the universe is a kind of product of a cosmic architect, and if we've been created in his image and we can think his thoughts after him, then we can actually go and figure all of this out. You would never think any of that as an atheist, that the universe is going to be governed by all these neat little equations. And so why would you think that as an atheist? They thought that. They had to believe that before they actually went out and discovered it. And they turned out to be absolutely correct and so on. And yet, even when I break that down, and I give quotations from Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and all these people on what they believed, a lot of the online atheists I run into think, nope, they're all closet atheists. They were just closet atheists. They were just pretending to be Christian because that was the culture at the time. But undercover, they were atheists. And there are multiple problems with that. Namely, we have their letters and so on, too, to other private individuals. They wouldn't need to pretend if they're writing their cousin and so on. So, yeah, anyway.
No, you're absolutely right. What's so interesting about that, I wanted to not only chronicle the impact that Jesus had, the great impact, because you're right, on science, there's the oversized impact of Christians on science is sick. Mm-hmm. The scientific revolution is darn near entirely Christian, of one denomination or another. And all the church, all the science fathers, we started to do this research, we collected a list of about almost 1,000 scientists who are Christians who are historically important in science. And we started to see that there were these expressions by secular sources that this is the father of modern astronomy. This is the father of modern biology. This is the father of quantum mechanics. These are Christians. Mm-hmm. So I thought, let's go back. I want you to make a list of all of the science fathers who are Christ followers. That list is ridiculous. Every major scientific category. And even those that Muslims would say, well, no, we own that. Well, actually, you might own a predecessor, but the modern version of this scientific discipline, sorry, it's a Christ follower who formed it. Now, that was so interesting about that is I didn't want just the impact. I said, okay, now let's go back and let's read the personal journals of these science fathers to see what they really believed about Jesus. And it turns out that, yeah, it's true. From the personal journals of the science fathers, you can reconstruct more detail about, in fact, they even quote scripture often. So you can recall scripture quotes than you can from the church fathers. Now think about that for a second. And I am grossly underestimating the amount of information that's retrievable. Here's why. If you go and look for these kinds of sources, where would you go? I mean, we went online, we read books and resources, and for the most part, the religious identity of the science fathers has been scrubbed. So that I'm sure only capturing a portion of all of those who were Christ followers. But I got enough list on that, and it's in the footnotes of the book, that will help people to see that it's not just that they had huge impact. It's like you said, these are not closet atheists. No, actually, in their personal journals, you can reconstruct the story of Jesus, every aspect of the story, his birth, his childhood, his ministry, his mission, his death on the cross, all the miracles he worked. These folks did not, like you said something really important, this idea that Christian scientists believed they were worshiping God. Now, think about that for a second. If you're just geeked out on physics, you can be a good physics professor because you're geeked out on physics. That's what you like. Mm-hmm. But if you not only are geeked out on physics, but you think that you are worshiping the God who you are bending your knee to, oh, trust me, the level of dedication there is much higher. You're not just geeked out. You're actually worshiping the God of the universe. And that is the amazing thing about all of these science fathers. You're right. Kepler says we just thought we were, thinking God's thoughts after him, that we were these high priests of this scientific discipline, and we wanted not to venerate our own intellect. We wanted to venerate the God of all intellect, and that's the kind of thing that level is different. Most of us have an interest in certain things, but we don't see it as a form of worship, and that drives us to a whole nother level of excellence. And so that's why I think you see, there's a lot of reasons why you see this. Look, for the most part, I don't think that before Christians came on the planet, this idea of a single orderly God that's distinct from his creation, that matter is not unworthy of our investigation, that we are a people group who in monasteries are willing to get our fingers dirty. We'll touch things. We'll do cadavers. We'll do all of this. We'll actually move this discipline that used to be called natural philosophy, because it was done entirely with our minds, that we are the ones who were touching the sick, who were serving the poor, who were digging into the dirt to harvest crops. And we had no problem then moving toward a physical examination of our philosophies about nature. That simple shift in worldview ignited the sciences, and that's why so many Christ followers were so deeply involved. By the way, you know this. I did a chart of all the scientists who are involved in history, and there's a huge golden age of Islamic endeavors, about to the 12th, 13th, 14th century, in which Muslims contributed deeply to the sciences, but it stopped. Mm-hmm. Now, we can argue why it stopped, but the modern sciences that we typically think about are not founded by Muslims. They contributed to a progress for sure. But that's why the scientific revolution, I didn't invent that term. That's not a term that's invented by Christians. That's a secular term that is dominated by historically Christian scientists. So I think it's interesting that this worldview births science in a way that no other worldview has ever birthed science. It's something for at least, does it mean that Christianity is true? No, I'm a cumulative case guy. I've never gone into a jury trial with one piece of it. I don't even like cases that sit on one witness. Good luck with that. I would much rather have a cumulative case so these can be a check and balance system in place from evidence. And that's what we have here. That this one aspect of history does not demonstrate that Jesus is God. But when you put the whole case together, it's harder, I think, to ignore who Jesus really was.
And the scientific aspect kind of fits the same pattern as the other issues you mentioned, in that the religions that came after Jesus, they tried to incorporate him somehow. And even the religions that came before Jesus, they tried to rewrite the script a little bit to include Jesus after Jesus came along. But then you have like the scientific revolution, and now of course you have plenty of atheist scientists now, but
Yes.
it's like they're doing the same thing that Islam did. They're taking some parts that they couldn't kind of function without, that they still want a piece of it. And so, I mean, I'm not talking about them making Jesus a great moral teacher and trying to get him that way, but the idea that this universe is created by a mind, and you've seen the artwork back then. They would depict like God, like compasses and so on. That
Yes.
God is this architect and so on. He's calculating everything, and so there. On the one hand, there's this idea that a powerful mind is behind all of this, and therefore that there are laws governing it, like the same sort of laws that an architect would use, and that we're the kind of thing that can figure this out, that we are the kind of thing that we've been made with the ability to comprehend God's thoughts if we give this our attention. And notice, neither one of those things would make any sense on atheism. It wouldn't make any sense to think that there's a mind, or that this mind use all these laws to govern the universe. And second, why would you think that we're the kinds of things? I mean, we're smarter than rats, but all of our abilities, all of our cognitive faculties, according to the standard atheistic picture, all of our cognitive faculties were selected because they helped us survive and reproduce. So
Right.
they helped.
It's species arrogance that makes us think we're at the top of this. That in other words, there's no understanding beyond our own that's necessary. Yeah, you're absolutely. Why would we trust our own intellect if we're not? Yeah, exactly. So I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think this is one of the things that me as an atheist, we stand on the shoulders. But I think it's interesting. We talked about how Islam seems to. There's a book, you probably know a lot more about this than me, The Closing of the Muslim Mind. So I bought this book early on, and as soon as it was published, and kind of wanted to understand, why is it that there's a golden age? Here's my fear, David. I don't want there to be a golden age of Christianity in the sciences. I don't want us to be able to look 1,000 years from now and say, oh yeah, there was a time when Christians actually, they contributed something. But now it's like, no, well, look, we're in a danger. I think for many political reasons. Like, we're in a place right now where this last year, have we not said to ourselves, do we trust the sciences? The sciences they're trying to control us with the sciences. You hear this kind of language. Listen, family, do not step out of our leadership role in the sciences when we don't need to. It's our worldview that it ignited the sciences. Don't give that away. Don't let us fall into this idea that we can't trust. Look, everything's about inferences. I use the same scientific data to make a case for God that the atheists use to make a case against God. The data is rather neutral. It's being inferred by somebody. We as Christians have the ability to infer properly from data. Don't surrender that right now, and let them say 1,000 years from now there was a golden age for us as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all right. Well, we said we're going to keep this to around an hour, so we still got a few minutes left. So you put together your book, your blood spattered book. Any final thoughts before we close out for everyone who's watching? Because keep in mind, there are a lot of Muslims watching. There are a lot of other people watching. There are people watching from all over the world, and so a lot of the information you shared in that short presentation was new. So,
well, let me throw this out to you. It's interesting to me that this is the guy who creates what we call the first century. And all of us have that kind of put that on our calendar, right? We still mark time this way. It's not the first century of humans, not the first century of humans who record history, but it is called the first century. Why? Why would this be the guy? So if you were to look back at every important, just Google it. I mean, search it on your resources, look at your books, historical books. Who are the most important historical figures in the first century that would cause this kind of change in our calendar? I looked at all of them. To be honest, all of them combined, you won't even know. I made a list of these in the last chapter. Everyone who appeared in the first century contemporaneous with Jesus, you will only recognize maybe 10% of them. And these are world leaders in different regions, right? They are empire leaders in different regions of the world. And none of them are even, even memorable. Okay. Not only that, if you look at all of those people who were empire leaders throughout history, leaders of nations, I've made a list of all of those. And we haven't ordered our calendar around those either. If you make a list of all those people who were deities or said they were deities or religious leaders, we haven't ordered our calendar. How is it that this guy, this nobody, this ancient Jewish sage who only had 3 years of public ministry, born in a small, insignificant, nowhere town, grew up in another insignificant, nowhere town, never traveled more than 200 miles, never led a nation, never wrote a book, never had a family and children who could descend and actually make a case for him, never ruled an army, never wrote a concert, never had the kind of education that other elites have had, okay? Never had the kind of political connections or social connections they had, never had a wife, never even had the respect of his community. As a matter of fact, he was pursued by those who had power and rejected by the people who were religious. He was abandoned and denied by the people who said they were his followers. Okay, then he was falsely accused, mocked, brutally beaten, executed in a shameful way, and then he has to borrow a grave. Okay, this is the guy who ends up changing our history. This is the guy whose fingerprints can be recovered and whose story can be reconstructed from literature, art, music, education, science, and world religions. How can this be? This is why that Bayesian kind of experiment you were talking about makes sense to me now. I should have probably put it that way in the last chapter. If you look at this and you ask yourself, okay, so what would I expect of that kind of guy? That's not what we get. Now, if you said, okay, if God was to enter into the world, his own creation, wouldn't you expect to find his fingerprints everywhere? This is one of the objections we often hear. How can it be that Jesus is God, the only people who record? What, so 4 gospel authors, that's it? Well, no. Yeah, but you're just not aware. I mean, maybe you haven't been paying attention to all the other literature, art, music, education, and science that's built on that Christian worldview that repeats and reiterates the story of Jesus. Look, folks, this isn't happening for any other religious figure. This just happens to this nobody. Because that nobody ends up being a somebody. It's not a person of interest to begin with. He was never a person. Look, this is what he said. He accepted worship when people in his generation who were Jews would never have accepted. You remember Peter? He sees Cornelius, get up off the floor. I'm just a man. Paul says, no, I'm just a man. Don't be worshiping me. Jesus repeatedly accepts the worship at every stage of his life of other humans. He says the angels belong to him. He said he came from a different world. He and the Father were one. He uses the great I am. He spoke as God. He never spoke like, hey, the Lord Almighty says. No, he said, I say to you. He spoke as God, not for God. This is a guy who claimed to be God. And it turns out his impact is what you would expect from God. Why would you? And by the way, and everyone else is mentioning it. Everyone else is, if you're listening to this and you're not a Christian, you already have Jesus in your system. And we don't have your leader in our system. Because it turns out the God of the universe is kind of a jealous God who wants us to give him alone our devotion. So it seems to me that if you're going to start anywhere as a spiritual seeker, you should start with Jesus because he's everywhere else anyway. Mm-hmm. So why not just start with him? And only he has had this kind of impact on history.
Definitely an awesome place to start. Well, thank you, Jay, and for everyone who's watching. If you want to get a copy of Person of Interest, I put a link to Amazon in the description box, so you can just click on that. It'll take you to the link on Amazon. You get the hard copy. Get it on Kindle. Jay, if you ever just want to say in closing, if there's ever any suspects and you know they're definitely guilty, but you just don't have the evidence, Tell me where to find him. The Dizzle will take care of it. All right.
I know. You know what? I was just thinking as you were introducing yourself earlier, David. You have to give me a nickname. I feel like I need a nickname. Okay, you have a nickname. I need a nickname. Although I'm afraid for you to say it right now. Don't say it right now because I'll be embarrassed of it. Okay. But you have to send it to me, and then I will use it from that point on, okay? Because I know you're already looking to slam me right now with some goofy nickname. I can tell by the look on your face.
Yeah, the first thing that popped into my head was Jay Wizzle. That's not a good one. That's not a good one.
No, that's not. You know what? See, I'm sorry I even brought it up.
All right, yeah, we'll come up with something. All right,
okay, cool.
So everyone's watching, grab the book, and thank you, Jay, for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. I appreciate you.
All right, catch you all later.